Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This week we have The Lesbian Heresy by Sheila Jeffries, discussed by Anna Prats and Sheila Jeffries. It's Sunday the 5th of June, and this series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, media, and schools. Thank you so much for coming to listen to this, and we're going to start off with Anna Prats, who is from Mallorca and the author of the book, Sheila Jeffries. So,
welcome everyone, and thank you, Sheila, for asking me to be here to talk about The Lesbian Heresy, published in 1993. First of all, I would like to comment that yesterday in Spain, the public television broadcasted the film Portrait of a Lady on Fire, directed by Celine Chama, a story of what women have lived throughout history, and I think is wonderful that many girls and women have had access to this film. So now I'll start introducing myself, then I will go on to explain how Sheila's book had an impact on me personally, and then we'll discuss some of the key points of the book. I'm a journalist, currently in my second year of my master's degree in women's politics, born in a Spanish island called Mallorca, and I have done some research on prostitution. I have also been translating texts related to feminism and lesbian existence for about 5 years, especially from the 70s and the 80s, which I felt were essential for women who could not read English to have access to my blog. I also translated into Spanish 2 of Sheila's books, a collection of her essays and gender hurts. And well, when I first read The Lesbian Heresy, I think I was about 21 years old. I had just finished my degree in journalism and I was heterosexual by the time. The thing is that I tried to read it and I didn't understand it very well. And that was kind of honesty shock, because I had started to read Andrea Dworkin, Kate Millett, etc. by the time, and I was beginning to understand a small part of what would later be a personal and political revolution in my life. I think what happened to me, that I lacked the context to understand everything that was presented to me as a mystery. As when I was very young, I read texts that I didn't understand, but I read them even though I didn't understand them, as if between the lines I would find the answer to the mystery. So thanks that not understanding so much, I started to look for that context. I must say thanks to feminists in Latin America, who shared very generously on social networks all the radical feminist books they found in PDF, books that I couldn't afford because of my student economy at the time. Because in Spain, it happens that a large part of self-styled radical feminism does not include criticism of the institution of compulsory heterosexuality. So it's heterofeminism as you define in the book, and 2 or 3 lesbian feminists such as Vito Virtudes or Rebecca Crespo spread radical or lesbian theory. But in Latin America, as I see it, radical feminism is entirely lesbian. Then it happened that I started to get more and more involved in the radical feminist movement, and I fell in love with a woman. I must say I'd never have considered it before, but at that moment I read a phrase that Kate Millett said in a Spanish newspaper interview in 1983, which was, "I think that for me, as for many other women like me in the movement, women who love other women, it was as natural as it was inevitable. The camaraderie we forged led us to simply cross the sexual barrier." She said so, but even so, I didn't have all the answers that I needed. So I went back to The Lesbian Heresy for the second time to understand what was happening to me. And it was like, I don't know if this expression exists in English, but in Spanish we say, I feel like being thrown a jug of cold water. My whole base collapsed and I could begin to see much further, as shocking and painful as it was. Painful in the sense that I feel cheated, and I felt that all women should know many of the truths that were told in The Lesbian Heresy. I also began to read Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, Cheryl Clark, Monique Wittig, and particularly Mary Daly, whom I have studied and continue to study in depth and have dedicated my master's thesis in women's politics, but also autonomous feminists and Latin American lesbians such as Margarita Pisano, Andrea Franulik. In short, many radical theorists and lesbians who began to provide me with the context I needed to understand the whole issue. I remember that at that time, when the questioning of the queer issue began to arrive in Spain from Anglo-Saxon context, a very violent debate on sexuality began to take place on social networks. The issue was that biologist arguments were used against queer activists, such as "we are born women," and the supposed biologism of sexuality was also included as an argument to combat issues like the cotton ceiling. In short, I think that The Lesbian Heresy is a visionary book of everything that is being put on the table for debate today, as well as giving the keys to understanding the reality through a historical perspective and many bibliographical sources. So my first question for you, Sheila, would be, what was the context to writing this book in 1993, and how was the book received by feminist women?
What is lovely for me is to be able to talk with a younger woman like yourself about this book 30 years after writing it. I mean, that's extraordinary to be able to do that, and for the book to have some meaning and some significance now, because of course, as you know, there were a couple of dead decades when nobody was interested in radical lesbian feminism at all. So I'll just show my copy of the book for the moment. And this is the Spin Effects copy produced in Australia in 1993. I had moved to Australia in 1991. So, and the women at Spin Effects and Artrons who were my friends. And so I did the book there. And then it was published later in by the Women's Press in Britain and by a Spanish press as well, Catedra. So how did I come to write it? Well, when I wrote it, I'd already written 2 books. And those books were Anticlimax and Inter Enemies and Anticlimax. Those 2 books are about 2 of what the male historians call the sexual revolutions of the 20th century. Spinster was about the 20s or leading up to the 20s, and Anticlimax was about the 60s and 70s. And I needed to say that these revolutions were nothing to do with women. They were about men's demands and the freedom of male sexuality and so on. So that's what I said in those books, looking at sexology and so on. And this book is subtitled the Lesbian Sexual Revolution, because it was clear to me by 1993 that the values of that male sexual revolution had been extended across to the lesbian community, mainly for profit, of course, and to create a sex industry. And I needed to be able to talk about that. Now, the reason I needed to write a book, particularly, was, yes, the lesbian sexual revolution was happening, and I was appalled by that because it destroyed lesbian feminism. But also because of what we were losing. And anyone who doesn't know what we had and what we were losing should probably read my book, The Lesbian Revolution, because I really describe that in there. The politics, the theory, the ethics, the culture, the community, the theatre, the music, etc. We had an extraordinary culture in the 70s and 80s in which we lived. I mean, we didn't have to take part in mainstream culture, which is extraordinary to imagine now. And, you know, when just before this webinar, I was talking about how we used to have something called the Lesbian Review of Books. Can you imagine that? Very serious. All the lesbian feminist books that were coming out, discussed by serious people. It's impossible to imagine such a thing existing now. So we had so much and we were losing it. And we were losing it because of the values and practices of the lesbian sexual revolution that were coming into the lesbian community. I mean, what's happening in the 80s, for instance, is that a lesbian sadomasochist movement was developing. in the States and then in Britain. So by the mid to late 1980s, there was sadomasochists seeking to, it was a bit like what's happening with transgender activists now. There was an interruption of all our events. Everything had to be about sadomasochism. Sadomasochists were coming to our discos, to our marches, to our events. And they were covered in swastikas and all of the trappings of fascism, of course, because that was very exciting to them. And we were losing it. You know, we had to have dress codes at our discos that nobody was allowed to come in with studs, black leather, and so on and so on and so on, because it was clear this was a terrible threat. And the gay men's media absolutely loved it, and the straight male media, the Guardian, absolutely loved it. They loved to see lesbians in black leather chaps and no knickers using dildos on women and so on. It's very pornographic. They absolutely loved it. And all of our values of equality, eroticizing equality, woman loving, and so on were enormously threatened about this by all of that. So I think that's why I wrote the book. What else? What struck you? What were the ideas that you really liked?
For me, it's nearly impossible to imagine this loss of culture and lesbian theory. And the introduction of the book tells us about a context in which feminists examine everything under the premise that the personal is political, including patriarchal notions of lesbian existence and sexuality, with the aim of creating a feminist universe based upon self-love, woman-identified women, and women-loving women, which is always political in a patriarchal context that forces us to be heterosexual and to hate oneself and to hate other women. And under these premises, every woman can be a lesbian as a choice of love for oneself and a choice of freedom. And that idea changed my life completely. And another idea that struck me was the difference between the conception of lesbian existence in the 70s and how that idea evolved through the introduction of the sexology model. I was born in 1995, so this book has more years than I do. And I grew up with these essentialist notions of sexuality and relationships. I have been told that you could be born lesbian, heterosexual, or bisexual. And because I had only been involved with men up to that point, it was inconceivable for me to question that. In the Spanish translation of the book, also a concept is used that also caught my attention at the time, which is the politics of flirting. And in the original is used the term fancying. Anyway, I never liked so much going out like for flirting, because it seems to me that the whole thing was based on playing a role, objectifying, being objectified. And I think, what do you like about that person? The physical image they are projecting at the moment, based on what? Based on patriarchal beauty stereotypes. So that idea of fancying really struck me and made me question a lot of the normalized practices of my generation. But the chapter that struck me the most, perhaps we can dwell more on it later, is chapter 4, which talk about essentialism in the construction of lesbian existence. And at that time, I think 2018, the problem of queer ideology in relation to lesbian existence was beginning to be talked about more generally here in Spain. So in order to counter these ideas that were harmful to lesbian women, many women began to hold on to an essential lesbian notion based on genitality and sexological notions. And in Spain, for many years, the concept of sexual preference was used and then rejected because of ideas coming from gay men and pseudo-lesbians or pseudo-lesbians, to use a Mary Daly's concept. And that idea that it was not a choice because they were born that way. So a lot of women and men self-described gender criticals began to use the concept of sexual orientation as something innate, which I and so many radical and lesbian feminists before me rejected. So many lesbians began to attack me cruelly, even exposing my life, often invented on social networks, for saying that I was a lesbian. And according to them, I had to say I was bisexual or even heterosexual. Otherwise, according to them, I would be saying the same thing as men who claim to be women. And even my family found it inconceivable that, having fallen in love with a boy before, I could fall in love with a girl, because of, according to them, that was something must new in childhood or adolescence. So I would like to do on the term sexual orientation. It's a term I don't use because I think it's too closely associated with essentialist ideas of sexuality. And also from your book and other essays on lesbian existence, we learn that lesbian existence is much more than that. Do you think it's still useful to keep using it?
Yes, I absolutely agree. The term sexual orientation has nothing to do with lesbian feminism. It suggests that it is possible to simply fancy or sexually desire a person of a particular sex, and if it's both sexes, then you're bisexual. That's the idea of bisexuality is absolutely absurd. You know, every so often you love a person of the ruling class, and every so often you love a person of the oppressed class, as if that could be the same or equal. It's a really, really strange idea. But yes, of course, lesbian feminism is hugely more than that. I mean, the interesting thing is that there's very few books, very few writings on what is lesbian feminism. It was so huge, and that what we built out of it was so huge. But we take bits from Mary Daly, we take bits from other places. So that there's very little actually saying what it is. And I have tried to do that particularly in Unpacking Queer Politics in 2003. I tried to give a sort of breakdown of what it is. But obviously, lesbian feminists did not think that lesbianism was biological, because we were a political movement developed out of the 60s and 70s when social constructionism was what everybody believed in. Nobody believed that Black people were innately some kind of thing, or that women were innately some kind of thing, or that sexuality was, well, there were people who believed that sexuality was biological, the doctors, the sexologists and so on. But even many gay men at that time, the gay men of gay liberation, did not believe in biology. I know it's very difficult to believe now, but generally we understood that the way in which behavior was socially and politically constructed, knowing about that, was a revolutionary principle, which made it possible to have a revolution because we could change all that. And of course, lesbian feminists applied this to lesbianism, and we said it is possible to choose. Many of the lesbian feminists had been lesbians before they found feminism, but also thousands and thousands and thousands chose to leave men and became lesbians, like me and many of my other friends who are actually in the chat now. We chose this. It wasn't seen as surprising at the time. In fact, I had a PhD student who looked at how women felt about their lesbianism, was it chosen or biological, in the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. She interviewed them, 15 years ago, about how they had come to lesbianism. And in the 70s, the vast majority said they chose it. In the 80s, it was half and half. By the 90s, the majority said it was biological. So what you're able to think, and indeed what you're able to think determines what you're able to do, changes according to the politics of the time. We're now in an incredibly conservative time when there's been a huge backlash against feminism and lesbianism. And so the overwhelming idea now amongst young women, how they've been absolutely brainwashed in this way, is that sexuality is biological and that lesbianism is biological.
And that's why I think that this book is not only for lesbian women, but for all women. One of the sentences you say is that lesbian feminism pursues the creation of a world where lesbians can live, because in that world, all women will be free. How would you explain this sentence to women who are listening to us now and have just landed in feminism and perhaps are in situation of heterosexuality?
Yes, there is a lot to explain, and that's quite difficult. We did, of course, say and do say that heterosexuality is a political institution. That doesn't mean that some people are not simply heterosexual, but that heterosexuality has been constructed into a political institution in order to control women and make women available to men. One woman in this particular culture, in some cultures it would be more, in each household, to be sexually available, to be used, to do the housework, to reproduce babies that will be owned by the man, to do the emotional labor, to do all of those kinds of labor that are absolutely free. And so in that way, the oppression of women through heterosexuality and individual relationships is the very basis of capitalism too. Capitalism couldn't possibly exist without the massive amount of free labor of women, which is just taken for granted. The free labor of women, which means that women will never earn what men do. They'll never have pensions when they are older, and all of the other problems involved in heterosexuality. So I think that idea is not well understood now. And indeed, I was just in the park when I was looking at your questions and thinking, how I'm going to respond to this. And I was seeing two little girls, well, all the little girls, all the children in the park, because it's a half-term holiday for the Queen's Jubilee, and there's lots of little girls in the park, they all had long hair. I mean, really halfway down their back, and they were 7, 8, 9 years old. Often it looked, pretty dreadful, because 7, 8, and 9 years old girls are not doing with it all the extraordinary complex procedures that women are expected to do. And that is compulsory heterosexuality at a very, very young age. They were wearing funny little strappy sandals, whereas the boys had trainers, they had shorts, they had short hair. So the boys were allowed to be full human beings because they were not expected to be the sex objects of a superior class, whereas the girls were totally crippled by all of those impositions, very serious physical impositions upon themselves for a very, very young age. So that's what heterosexuality does, and it constructs women to be heterosexual, to only think about men as possible companions, and so on. So heterosexuality isn't a choice for women in the sense that you can potentially choose to be a lesbian, because you can potentially choose against what is imposed upon you. But since heterosexuality is totally imposed, as Adrian Rich said, it is compulsory, there's not really a way in which women can choose it. They can leave it, but it's very, very difficult for them to choose it. There's no alternatives offered. There's no education about lesbianism and what a wonderful idea it would be to be a lesbian, because lesbians are much more likely to help in childcare or help in housework if you want. You don't need to be biologically technologized to prevent contraception, to prevent becoming pregnant. None of the advantages of lesbianism are mentioned. There isn't a lesbian literature or culture, in there's vastly less now than there was in the 1980s and even the 1990s. So lesbianism is suppressed. We're in a position where lesbians, young lesbians, don't even want to call themselves lesbian anymore. They make up ridiculous terms like non-binary and so on, or they use the men's term queer because they cannot bear to feel proud about themselves. So yes, that's what heterosexuality is all about. I hope that's the sort of answer you wanted there. But
yes, and in the first chapter, you talk about passionate friendships between women throughout history, particularly during the Victorian era, and the impact of sexology on the construction of these friendships, and relate this to that happened in the 80s, where some lesbians or pseudo-lesbians began to use the terms butch and femme, which also began to be used in sexology and lesbian pornography by men. And recently, I also made that connection reading your book, The Spinster and Her Enemies, where sexologists classified lesbians in two categories, the homosexual and the pseudo-homosexual. And you say that the pseudo-homosexual was characterized as a woman who did not necessarily fit the masculine stereotype, who had been seduced by a real homosexual and had been led away from a natural heterosexuality to which she was expected to return, and real homosexuality was considered to be innate and pseudo-homosexuality a temporary divergence, according Ellis, the sexologist, and that described pseudo-homosexuality as a spurious imitation. Do you think that since you wrote the book, this sexological and heterosexual construction of lesbian existence has been reinforced? And if you think that, what do you think about have been the factors that have accentuated this construction?
Well, certainly this sexological understanding of biology and butch and femme and all of that has been reimposed. It's what is commonly understood now about lesbianism, because the wonderful liberatory moment in which we could think differently about this has gone. We are trying to bring it back. So yes, I think it's very nice that you picked out that bit from Spinster and Her Enemies about the pseudo-homosexual. Indeed, the sexologists believed that an actual lesbian had an biological element in them of the male in her. And they used to describe this in absolutely hilarious ways, because it wasn't possible to imagine somebody having a relationship with a woman, especially if she didn't have a penis, if she wasn't at least masculine. So a real lesbian, they thought was masculine, which is now called butch. And the lesbian she had relationships with, who was really heterosexual, but was led astray by the something or other eyes of the invert. There were some wonderful quotations at the time. She gets sort of seduced and drawn in. She would now be seen as the femme. She was not properly heterosexual because she wasn't masculine. She could potentially have had relationships with men before and so on. So the sexologists, in order to understand this impossible to understand thing, which is women gloriously loving each other as equals, because they couldn't possibly understand that, they invented this sexological relationship of butch and femme. And indeed, there were many in the lesbian community in the early 20th century who did relate to each other in these forms. And when lesbians first started becoming feminists in the late 60s, very early 70s, those lesbians themselves who had been involved in butch and femme relationships wrote wonderful work, such as in Sappho was a right-on woman, and in Julia Penelope's work, in which they completely reject the terrible imposition of butch and femme roles on women, which prevents them loving anybody that they might choose to love. I mean, I can remember being in a gay bar in Leeds back in about 1978, and a lesbian coming up to me in the women's toilets and saying, "Are you butch or femme?" And I was completely astonished because neither of those things had ever occurred to me. So what she was telling me was, though she was obviously attracted enough to come up to me, if I had said I was the wrong one, she could not have pursued that attraction. I mean, an extraordinary situation. So butch and femme carves out who women are supposed to love. It imposes upon them a gender identity. Men understood that, the masculine lesbian was able to take the initiative, have relationships with women, whereas the femme had to passively accept them, and so on. What is astonishing is the degree to which this has come back, and all the liberatory egalitarian lesbianism that we created went. I mean, I have written about this quite a bit. And what I've argued is that when butch and femme were brought back, particularly in the US, in the 1980s, by some women who had been critical before, in fact, it was as a mild form of sadomasochism, because the sadomasochist movement was underway. And if you read the butch and femme writings of the time, they're all about women getting wet on bar stools because they see this extraordinary butch come into the room and so on. So it was very sadomasochist in the way it was written. It was written in a kind of pornography. So I understand that bringing back a butch and femme there as being a part of that lesbian sexual revolution to make lesbians pornographic in a way. What I don't understand is why these days so many lesbians are prepared to say, "I am butch, that's what a lesbian is. You're not a lesbian if you're not this, that, and the other," in these extraordinary ways. I mean, that's not, I think, just a sexual thing. It's something else. Butch has become the lesbian. Femme rather drops off the map because there aren't many lesbian feminists prepared to say, there are a few, "I'm really femme. I'm somebody who, likes to wear frilly dresses and does the cooking." I mean, there's not many lesbians do that. But butch, which goes, of course, it's much more exciting. It's about being a member of the masculine class and having the behaviors of the ruling class. It's much more exciting to do. But it is a problem because it divides lesbians completely into two halves. I mean, there are butch conferences and lesbian conferences. It makes the political potential of egalitarian lesbianism, which can upturn the whole way we think about gender, sex role stereotypes, and sex. It makes all of that impossible to imagine. So in the rebirth of feminism that we're having now, which is very exciting, and lesbian feminism, that's something we need to work on. We need to bring back the liberatory, the extraordinary impulses of the 1970s, when it was possible to imagine equality between lesbians and that any woman can be a lesbian.
And this brings me to the issue of pornography that you discuss in chapter 2. You talk about the Lesbian Revolution and how the patriarchy and the porn industry managed to counteract this revolution of freedom that was happening in the 80s. Something that caught my attention in this rereading I have done for this webinar is that you mentioned sex toys. Nowadays, at least in Spain, we see self-described radical and lesbian feminist influencers, which in fact they are gender critical influencers, promoting sex shops with discount codes to buy sex toys. It's something that generated a lot of disgust in me, but I couldn't always find the words to explain why, given that a large majority of self-described anthems use them. This leads me to think about what a pornographic construction of pleasure is held, mostly even in lesbian feminist spaces, and the refusal to question any aspect related to sexuality. And I also remember Julia Long's words when you commented on Janice Raymond's book, A Passion for Friends, I think, which explained that this identitarianism even applied to lesbianism. And now we have practically no spaces to talk about and question sexual practice between women, not even to spend time together in women's spaces, but nevertheless, we long for something that once existed, whereas before you were simply naming something that was happening. And how do you think we can bridge this gap between the porn-constructed lesbian and the lesbian feminism, and how can we prevent this construction from also falling into identitarianism?
I mean, this is a really interesting point, because I'm fascinated and alarmed by what is likely to have happened, which is that for young lesbians, they are likely to have come across so-called lesbian pornography, and their sexual responses will have been attuned to that pornography. So actually talking about how to create an egalitarian sexuality now will be so much more difficult than it was before. Because of course, in the old days, I know this is difficult to imagine, there was no lesbian pornography. There wasn't very much pornography generally. There was a bit of lesbian pornography created by men, but of course we didn't use that. But there was no such thing as lesbian pornography or lesbian sex toys. I know that's extraordinary to imagine. And so lesbian sex didn't make any money. It was entirely free. You didn't have to buy anything at all. What's more, we had no model. Because there was no pornography, there was nobody telling us how you did lesbian sex. And we were making it up as we went along. We went to bed with women and rolled around with great excitement for hours and hours, discovering women's bodies, discovering each other, discovering what was good. And it was just a totally, creative experience. Nobody told us what to do. Whereas now, of course, I believe that there are lesbians using dildos. I mean, this was absolutely not the case once upon a time. In the 1970s, lesbians were not using dildos. And as I say, I think in Lesbian Heresy, and in work like sexological work, lesbians were not seen as using dildos. I mean, they did this research and they didn't find that lesbians were using dildos, they were doing other things. In the 1980s, when the lesbian sex industry was constructed, dildos were of course developed because they made money. Lesbian sex shops were set up. And in fact, in Britain, I think the first lesbian sex shop named a dildo after me. It was called the Sheila, the spinster's best friend, after my first book, which was of course a deliberate insult, because of course we understood dildos to be imitations of the penis. We didn't understand why anybody wanted imitations of the penis. I mean, they would be very uncomfortable, potentially create damage inside a woman because they are hard. And what about hands? I mean, hands are marvelous. So it was extraordinary to us that lesbians would wish to do this, and we were horrified when dildos were brought in. But I presume if you're talking about lesbian sex shops now, it must be the case that these are being marketed to lesbians as what you do. So yes, it's a very, very serious problem. As I say, it's just interesting to me how much that model of sex now influences how lesbians feel about themselves. I mean, Marilyn Fry, the lesbian philosopher, wrote a wonderful article about what is lesbian sex, in which she said, when sex surveys are done, they ask, how many times do you do it in a week, or a year, or a month? Then based on heterosexuality, of course. And she points out that lesbians could never answer this, because there isn't a time. No ejaculation takes place. Lesbians can roll about with each other for hours without knowing if they've had one time. Have they had 60 times? How many times? Lesbian sex is unquantifiable and unimaginable in that heterosexual universe. So to lose that and have this terrible imposed sexological sex industry definition imposed is a pretty horrifying situation. So yes, we need to talk about that. And yes, you're absolutely right that it's very difficult to talk about, and nobody can. You can't really on social media discuss that. What is the purpose of a dildo? I mean, that's really not going to be something that can happen. We have to create a movement again where we can have discussions in small group, talk about all of these things, and once more politicize sexuality and lesbian sexuality.
That remembers me a book from 2008 that I read a few years ago, and that can only be described as pornography. And the book defines itself as follows. It says, the intention of the book is to build a pornography with a language of women to recover, in this way, a concept of pleasure and sexuality that men have usurped for their own benefit. I intend that this compilation of erotic stories will serve for lesbians to write and read more about sex. It's written by a woman who has championed the fight for homosexual rights here in Spain, such as homosexual marriage. And I vividly remember a scene of the book where two women were kissing and having sex, one supposedly bisexual and cheating on her husband. And at one point, one of them covers the other's eyes, and suddenly the one with the covered eye realizes that another person has joined the scene, a man. She realizes that he's a man because of the birth, and although at first she feels rejection, she ends up liking it. That is a forced heterosexualization through rape, pretending to be something feminist. And this nasty book is a continuum of what began in the 80s, I think, with the porn industry, and that you describe in the second chapter. And my question is how these sadomasochistic, violent, and forced heterosexuality practices be explained and analyzed in a more concrete way to lesbian women who are now largely absorbed by all these bisexual and queer politics. And in what other ways do you think this forced heterosexuality is being replicated to queer sexual practices today?
Yes, well, I think there is no doubt, as I was saying, that the pornography, supposed lesbian pornography, is heterosexualizing lesbian relationships. Now, when it took place, I mean, when in the 1980s, what happened was that lesbians who had been involved in the sex industry in the US, in prostitution and pornography for men, started to create magazines for women. And the first of those really was called On Our Backs. The feminist newsletter, American feminist newspaper of the time, Marvelous, which really kept the movement together and covered everything. I mean, what we have lost is extraordinary. But it was called Off Our Backs, in other words, getting men off our backs. So very deliberately, this first lesbian pornography magazine was called On Our Backs, meaning we want to be on our backs, we want to be submissive. And the beginning of the magazine, the advertising, well, the beginning of the magazine, it says that a lesbian is the lust of all women, condensed to the point of explosion, which is the opposite form of the wonderful statement in the Woman Identified Woman paper from 1970, which is the sort of foundation of lesbian feminism, where it says, a lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion, because we understood lesbianism as a form of resistance. It was women saying no, and women have to be extraordinarily brave and extraordinarily determined to say no to all of the forces that will punish them under male domination if they reject men and reject penises and choose to love women. So we said lesbianism is an act of resistance. It's political in and of itself. So whether or not a woman chooses to say she's a feminist, merely by making the statement of saying no to men and moving to women, it is a political act, and it is an act of resistance. So the lesbian porn industry and the women involved in it knew they were doing it against feminism, and that it was a backlash against feminism. And for the Lesbian Heresy, I realized that I needed to read. I wouldn't watch any of the stuff, and there were videos by that time, but I knew I needed to read some of the erotic stories and so on to work out what was going on. stories, for instance, like those of Pat Califia, because Pat Califia, the sadomasochist who's now supposedly transitioned, wrote a lot of pornography, as well as being a sex therapy expert and so on, writing in The Advocate, the male gay magazine. So I wanted to read those stories and find out what's happening. It's very, as you have just described, they were about women being raped by men in front of other women and women being tortured. It was always about power, because equality is not, as I often say, is not usually seen as very exciting, about as exciting as a cold rice pudding. Under male domination, where only power difference is exciting, and all sexual response is based upon male domination and women's submission, even if this is represented in lesbian and gay relationships. It's all based on what I call heterosexual desire, meaning a power difference, whether it's in lesbian, gay, heterosexual relationship. In that situation, it would be very surprising if equality could be seen as exciting, and it's not. All the pornography was about power difference. A lot of it, of course, had all the the imagery of fascism and so on and so on. It was very, very disturbing to read. I remember sitting in my front room in Putney, trying to read this stuff and crying. Tears would be pouring down my face as I read it. I'd have to keep stopping. Actually, tears are almost coming into my eyes as I think of it now. Reading the stuff was so difficult, and that wasn't even watching it to try and work out what was in there, because it was the death of everything. It was the death of all of our dreams of creating our wonderful equal love of women, transforming the world, taking our lesbian feminist ethics and values of loving women into the world, making it a different place. And there we were, back to women having their genitals burnt by a candle. And it was devastating to read, but I needed to read it and write about it, to describe it.
I think we are running out of time, so I'll move on a bit. And in chapter 5, you write about the impact of postmodern ideas on a certain vision of lesbian and gay theory. And in what ways have postmodern theory tried to ridicule and diminish lesbian feminism and the lesbian feminist project? Do you think this impact of postmodern ideas has managed to undermine the lesbian feminist project completely, or do you think there's still hope?
I think that there's no doubt that postmodern ideas, post-structuralism, as it's called, has hugely damaged feminism, as it has damaged all other political movements, socialism, any kind of liberation movements, because the ideas of postmodernism say that there's that you can't have teleological ideas. In other words, you can't plot a revolution, you can't desire serious social change. Those ideas represented in queer theory, like Michel Foucault and so on, argue that there's no real power structure, power comes from everywhere. It was all immensely undermining, because it wasn't possible to think feminism, to think of the power relations between men and women and fight as a class in that situation. So the biggest impact, of course, of queer theory, which is sort of postmodernism applied to gay men, and is actually about, I argue, in Unpacking Queer Politics, specifically male gay politics. I think queer theory was just coming in as I'm writing Lesbian Heresy, and I just start talking about it at the end of the book. But queer theory was what most affected lesbians, because in the 1990s, it became impossible to be a lesbian feminist. Lesbian feminists were just absolutely derided. And many lesbians went over to the gay boys, really, and started attacking lesbian feminists as being anti-sex and wanting to help us to have sex by, through sadomasochism and all of these other means. So it had an enormous impact on what lesbians were able to say about themselves. It was a tidal wave. Queer was a tidal wave. And I remember in Melbourne, when I was teaching a lesbian and gay politics course. Difficult to imagine now. I introduced the first lesbian and gay politics course in Australia, and I was teaching that from 1991. And I can remember that, by by the second time I taught it, a student came up to me and said, do you realize you've got Andrea Dworkin on your reading list? So queer happened, sadomasochism came in, and so I very quickly lost all the lesbian and gay students because they went to queer, and I ended up teaching a lesbian and gay course full of very enthusiastic heterosexual women who loved the radical feminism. So it was a very strange moment. But that's the moment at which this tidal wave of change happened. So yes, those theories were very, very important in the undermining of our politics.
I think another of the key points of the book is the appendix entitled Sadomasochism, the Erotic Cult of Fascism. And you explained that in 1981, during a visit to Amsterdam, to attend to the Women's Festival, you became aware of the relationship that existed between sadomasochism and fascism. And in this festival with a sadomasochistic theme, the justification was that sadomasochism was a private matter, and in the same week, the first fascist deputy after the war was elected in Amsterdam, but those feminists in Amsterdam still did not see maybe the relationship between the rise of fascism and the popularization of sadomasochism as a sexual practice. And currently, we can also draw a line, I think, between the total popularization of sadomasochism present in women's festivals, the International Women's Day, or the Pride March, with the warlike climate due to the war in Ukraine or other wars before. And in the first week war was declared, I searched, and Google searches for porn of Ukrainian women being raped by Russians increased exponentially. And the question is, what are the origins of this mechanism that transfers the erotic cult to fascism, and what are the mechanisms that continue to promote and celebrate it today?
Well, of course, the sex of the system of male domination is dominant submissive. It's the eroticizing of inequality and the eroticizing of all forms of structural inequality. So it is indeed in the practices of sadomasochism that were coming into the lesbian community in the 1980s. They were the practices of real and serious oppression. And in fact, I talk about this in my next book, which is coming out in September, Penile Imperialism. When you go online now, you find that there are lots of therapists who are teaching sadomasochism in order to help, mostly women, but some men, to overcome the oppression of race. Yes, race. So there's lots of stuff about sort of slavery and racism, which is eroticized, and also child sexual abuse, particularly for women and girls. So it's now taught for money as therapeutic. So there is no question that the basis of sadomasochism is the eroticizing of oppression, and it's very, very real kinds of oppression. And if we think about when I went back to, if I think back to when I went to that conference in San Francisco, none of us knew that there was going to be sadomasochism there. So we went in the first day and we discovered it. There were things like photographs of naked little girls, maybe 5 or 6 years old, totally covered in plastic cling film so that they couldn't breathe and so on the walls as soon as you walked through the door. So the torture of female children was right there. We were the contingent from Britain, and there was about 50 of us, absolutely shocked. So what we did was we met on a traffic island. Seems there was nowhere else for us to go. So we went to a traffic island and we sat on this traffic island and we said, what are we going to do? And we decided that we'd go to these workshops on sadomasochism. There were lots of workshops teaching it, particularly by men, men who said they were women who were teaching the workshops because they got in through sadomasochism into the lesbian community in particular. And we decided, okay, as soon as one of them says, now, haven't you all had sadomasochistic fantasies? And of course, the vast majority of women probably have. You are really, a sadomasochist. That's what they're going to say. You really are. You should be in this movement. That's who you are. We were all, as soon as they said that, we were all going to put our hands up, which we did, because it did happen, and say, yes, but we're going to end that. We're going to change the fantasies that have come from our oppression that undermine us so much, that make it so difficult for us to fight our oppression. And yes, back in London, the sadomasochism amongst gay men was huge. I remember going to a gay workshop of socialist men. They were all socialists. This is the extraordinary thing. They saw nothing wrong with eroticizing very serious, very vicious, real systems of oppression. And they were showing this pornography of like a man in, probably it was Tom of Finland type pornography, because he was the big icon, still is, and he does horrible sadomasochist racist stuff. A man in a Nazi costume peeing into a gutter and making another man lick it up. And I was just absolutely horrified. I burst out with absolute horror. So this is what was going on. So I wrote that last chapter actually in 1986, which was at the heart of when all of this was being made acceptable, in order to say, really, if you love the boot that kicks you into the gutter, you can't fight your revolution. You actually have to de-eroticize systems of oppression, power, and violence, and we have to create a sexuality of equality.
Maybe we can finish with the question that that of the definition of lesbian, because there are authors like Mary Daly that try to do so, to define lesbian. Do you think that the definition of lesbian that starts from a feminist paradigm in which some of us live is understandable for women or lesbians who still believe in patriarchal myths or patriarchal ways of understanding the world?
Well, I mean, what we have to do is, again, create radical lesbian feminism. And that means throwing out and overcoming all the sexological, biological forms and pornographic forms that have been impressed upon lesbians in the last couple of decades. So the first point about lesbian feminism, of course, is that it is woman loving. It's about women loving other women. That's the absolute fundamental. Choosing other women, seeing other women as crucial and important. And in fact, that's very hard to do under male supremacy, where women are pretty much hated and ridiculed, and men pretend they can be us, and so on and so on. So actually choosing women and loving women is the very basis of lesbian feminism. But of course, as I was saying earlier in this webinar, lesbianism is an act of resistance. And it's an act of resistance against male power and a resistance against the world that makes it impossible for women to be free. Lesbians can. We don't have to do any of the ridiculous things to our appearance to appeal to men. We don't have to cripple ourselves in shoes, hide our faces in makeup. We can love other women for the strong, wonderful human beings that they are. But also, of course, crucial to lesbian feminism is that it is not biological. Definitely, lesbianism is not biological. You can choose to be a lesbian, and choosing to be a lesbian is a revolutionary act. But also crucial to lesbian feminism is equality. Equality between women, and that we are there to fight the struggle for women to be equality, all women for equality in the world. So of course, we cannot eroticize power difference. We cannot create butch and femme hierarchies. All of those things are impossible for us. I think in the book I do mention that there's a difference between lesbians who are feminists and lesbian feminists. For some women, lesbianism and feminism are separate words. So they may privately feel that they are lesbians and it's not political. But of course it is. Inevitably it is. They can't get away from that. And that they can be feminists separately, involved in feminist activism, but the two things are not necessarily connected. In the Lesbian Heresy, I explain that lesbian feminism, those two words completely modify each other. So the feminism is lesbian, meaning that it's got to understand that heterosexuality is a political institution and so on. And the lesbianism is feminist because it's about equality and love for other women and so on. I do think that's an important difference because there are still many women who are not lesbian feminists who make a separation between their lesbianism and their feminism.
Yes, I think that's what's happening in much of the movement here in Spain. I would say that my conclusions would be that most of what you and other lesbian feminists have been warning about for decades has happened, although I believe firmly there is hope, and that from many places we are trying to rebuild the lesbian and feminist project you dream of.
Thank you. I'm really hoping you're going to be able to do that. But it's a huge edifice to have to recreate in very, very different times. In times when the pornography industry has totally undermined what it is for lesbians, and in a time when there's been a huge queer onslaught, in a time when men are pretending to be lesbians. It's a very, very difficult time, and we are not going to be able to do that unless we're able to actually meet up. I mean, the other thing I should have said when talking about everything that we had in the 1970s and 80s was, in that community, lesbians could find each other. They could start relationships with each other. They could love other women. In fact, it was very hard not to, because there was such excitement, and women were so absolutely marvelous that if you got into a group of women, you were going to fall in love with a woman. I mean, I should say rise in love. I don't like the expression fall in love, because really what we as lesbians do is rise in love with a woman. But there was all that community in which that could happen. That absolutely doesn't exist now. So we have the horrific invention of dating apps, which all these men are on, pretending to be lesbians. So instead of meeting another woman and doing the dance of the eyes across a room, being drawn to her flame in a space, we've now got these extraordinary dating apps, which again make money out of lesbian sex and make money out of lesbians. So yes, there is a big task, and your generation is going to have to. I'm sorry to say, this is a big responsibility, Anna.
Yes, I think so, but I'm very glad to talk to you and to talk with other women which have seen everything that now is almost lost.
Yes, and it is absolutely lovely to talk to you, and I hope to talk to many more young women who are creating this whole new revolution. So thank you very much for being prepared to discuss the book with me.
And thank you, Women Declaration International, for inviting me also.
It's a great pleasure for us.